Last time we talked about benthic communities in the shallower parts of the ocean, basically on the continental shelves. But now I want to talk about communities that exist below the continental shelves, in fact, below the continental slopes and rises and everything else, typically. And these collectively we would call the deep ocean benthic communities. We know far less about them. We know the most about intertidal areas, of course, because researchers have been able to literally walk up to an area when low tide is there and study the organisms that exist. Even across the continental shelf, it's much cheaper to get boats or shallow moving submersibles to study these things. But for the deep ocean, here's the big one, it's expensive to explore these things. And so we just don't know as much about them as the others. We divide the zones into successively deeper and deeper bathyal, abyssal, and hadal zones. And below 1,000 meters, actually probably a little bit shallower than that, there is absolutely no light whatsoever. The temperature is relatively uniform, uniformly cold, that is. It is very, very cold. In fact, very near freezing. If freezing is 0 degrees Celsius, then we're talking about less than freezing to here. The water's not iced up, though, of course, because there is salinity. There tends to also be areas of high oxygen down there, very, very high pressure, and then these so-called abyssal storms. Unique stuff. Well, where do they get their food? There is no primary productivity. In this diagram, you see the primary productivity are the plants and plankton that are up here on the continental shelf. Out in the ocean, there is also some primary productivity, obviously, with floating phytoplankton here. But how does the food or how does this ecosystem start down here? It comes typically from the death or sinking of dead organisms, plankton, poop, fecal pellets, fish dumping from our activities. But really, a lot comes from the large mammals or large fishes dying and sinking to the bottom. So they existed up here. Let's say this whale, he existed up here as part of one of these ecosystems that's associated with primary productivity, photosynthesis. But when he died, his body rained down, fell down to the bottom of this plain here, and then this becomes a food source which is sort of indirectly tied to the photosynthesis that took place in shallow water elsewhere. We thought that was essentially it. The deep sea benthic paradigm prior to as recently as the 70s was that there's not going to be much life down there. It's going to be scarce food, scarce organisms, and that's it. The thought was that deep sea is food limited, and so it only occurs from these sinkings of dead organisms, so you're going to have reduced biomass, reduced diversity, and this is what we've thought since the 1800s. Very, very old term. And so most ecologists thought that the deep sea is dull. Not much going on, just some boring existence of a few organisms and as far as benthic things. But that has proven not to be true. Since the 1980s, we've discovered and mapped out these things called hydrothermal vents, and the story of getting to there is an interesting one in and of itself. At first, only geologists were interested in this. So with their measuring, their geochemical measuring of water throughout, they realized that they had these sulfidic plumes of sulfide, sulfur-rich areas spewing up above the East Pacific Rise. The East Pacific Rise is one of these mid-ocean ridge areas that tectonics people would be interested in, geologists. And then there are abundance of helium-3 there as well. Okay, studying those led to the hypothesis that there should be vents there. The water or the land around these rises would be highly fractured. It's a tectonically active area after all. You've got thousands of feet of water above. All that high pressure is injecting the water into the mid-ocean ridge area where it encounters the high heat that's associated with those things, which circulates this throughout. Now you're going to have a dissolution, dissolving literally, of the rocks all around this area, so that water will come in its usual chemical soup from the surrounding oceans, but it will spew out from a vent as a much, much more enriched water source in various elements. We began to try to test this vent hypothesis by going to active rift zones, mid-ocean ridge zones, and looking for it, searching for these small changes in temperature, and found something very, very unique. So hydrothermal vents, these places were actively spewing out this superheated water. So first we found the vents. The vents had these literally black chimney, they're called these smokers, where hot mineral-laden water is being just shot out, just jetted out into the water above. And again, for here, I've put a much smaller, shorter video on hydrothermal vents for you to watch. Make sure you get that. This jettison of this super mineralized, mineral-rich, superheated water looks literally like smoke, so it's called these black smokers. And they grow these chimneys because as soon as this superheated water meets the cold water around it, it forces precipitation, the growth of minerals into these forms like this. If you look at them like this, here's this hot magma chamber down here, the water seeping in from above, both just through the sediment and also through cracks in the igneous rock, superheated, dissolution of other minerals, and then spewing it out geyser style on the sea floor like this, creating these chimneys. And then these plumes can trail off for many, many miles this way. And in fact, if you go back, this goes back to these early papers in the 60s and 70s where they were detecting these things. So these plumes were detected first, which led to the idea that they should have these things called vents. We hadn't seen them yet, hadn't discovered them at all. Going to these, we discovered that indeed this is true, and that the unique formation results in these black smoker chimneys that we're talking about. Notice as well, again, you can find all kinds of pictures and videos of these black smokers, but there's all this other stuff here, in fact, life. And so again, as recently as the 70s, we were starting to discover there are living organisms here. Now think about this. They're living in temperatures that are extremely hot, completely dark conditions, super high pressure conditions, and most importantly, there's no plants here. There's no photosynthesis. So how are they living? Well, again, look at the history a little bit more. The first discovery was from the submersible Alvin in the late 70s, and you look at some of the videos of this, and actually some of the videos of the scientists reacting, they're just open gasps at discovering this unique, otherworldly life forms around these black smokers. We have since found these things in more and more places. So as soon as they were found here, in the Galapagos Ridge and then along the East Pacific Rise, grant money just flowed like water towards researchers everywhere to study different segments of these rift sediment, these rift areas, and we began finding these vents, these things marked in black all over the place. So here's one map of the North Atlantic, North Pacific. Here then is a global map, and again here it's in red dots. You've got these are found all over the oceans, Indian Ocean, Atlantic Ocean, Pacific Ocean, and they've been given specific names, the McDonald's Seamount, the Lucky Strike, the Tenru Canyon, etc., for these. Well, what's there? First and foremost, giant tube worms. And by giant, I mean these things can be several meters tall. Giant clams. These things would be bigger than footballs, the size of 2 footballs. Giant mussels, giant crabs, microbial mats, and again, not a stitch of photosynthesis to be found. Instead, they are supported by chemosynthesis. Let's look at some of these things. Here's some of these giant clams and giant mussels. This Calyptogena, Bathymodiolus, present in huge amounts. So again, think about how this violates or falsifies the original deep sea hypothesis that life should be dull, small, minimal, diversity should be low. In fact, we found very, very high. Besides those mollusks, of course, they were climbing crustaceans all over these things, crabs, shrimp, but also fish, anemones, copepods, larvae of all of them, a big community. But the poster children for these things were the giant tube worms. They're the creatures that live closest to these sulfitic plumes, and interestingly enough, they were the first to sort of be captured, grabbed, taken back, dissected, and they don't have photosynthetic bacteria within them. They have chemosynthetic symbiotic bacteria. So within the flesh of their bodies, they have organisms, bacteria, that take chemical compounds and break them down to produce food, analogous to photosynthesis for plants in much shallower water. And Riftia and Rygia are just some of the generic names, the genus names for these tube worms. You see the geological influence there. These vents themselves are active for years, decades, but then they'll stop. And how things disperse from one to the other? Well, larval drift. Also, potentially over huge ocean basins, the dead whale hypothesis. So all of these things act as stepping stones in the deep to make sure that these communities, which can be separated by thousands of miles in the deep with not much going on in between from them, but the larvae, they exist long enough to settle vent to carcass to vent to carcass to carcass in stepping stone fashion across the ocean bottom. And the next few slides are just talking about different aspects of this, principally the temperature. Obviously, these are organisms that are adapted to extremely high temperatures. This is a map just of the outside of the tube versus the inside of the tube. So the outside of the tube can be very, very cold. This is in temperatures, degrees Celsius, from freezing to just above it. But inside the tube, the temperatures can be extremely hot. So the water coursing through these things for their body functions, extremely, extremely warm water. Just thermal adaptations, just comparing organisms from different places, etc. Maximal habitat temperature versus the Arrhenius break temperature, the temperature at which bodily functions start breaking down as the body literally breaks down, as the enzymes literally change bonding and break. And see, some of these organisms are adapted to extremely, extremely high temperatures compared to organisms that have lower thermal adaptations. They have higher numbers of link chains in their hemoglobin. The DNA for these organisms is thermostable. Interesting biological phenomenon, and still so much work, so much grant money is going into this. We're learning more and more about these things all the time. You have a distribution, just as we had zonations of organisms in the shallower waters. If you think back to the previous lecture, we had zonations both vertically and horizontally in the rocky shores and sandy shores. You have this in these deep areas as far as warmer habitats to cooler habitats and it's associated with, well, where does their DNA literally break down, denature? And so you've got a zonation built upon thermal adaptation. The growth rates are huge. Some of these things grow huge amounts, especially early in their life. They reach sexual maturity very quickly, and they start these colonies. Just another slide, more things about the growth rates of these organisms and the fact that they can live for decades. Trophic analysis, back to the chemosynthesis. Food is derived from energy produced by chemical breakdown by bacteria of these unique compounds that are spewing out of these vents. So archaea type of ancient bacteria, they thrive on the hydrogen sulfide, which is just spewing out of these vents. What they produce as waste products then are sugars, carbon dioxide, dissolved oxygen, basically food. Just to compare photosynthesis versus chemosynthesis, you have the photosynthesis that you've known and loved since you've learned it in elementary school versus the new chemosynthesis that is associated with these thermal vents. And again, just more slides about the chemosynthesis, and it's most studied from these riftia. Really interesting things. Again, watch the video if you want to know more about this. They even have unique morphological features, organisms. So this trophosome is a feature that these organisms have that their shallow water representatives do not have as part of this. These things are so unique that people have thought and sort of come up with the hypothesis that maybe life originated not in shallow water like we have in the picture on the left here. This is sort of the view of stromatolites and this sort of intertidal wave crashing type areas where we've presented for years as the origin of life, but it could just as easily have happened now in the deep ocean, in these chemosynthetic areas. And so we've had to rethink a lot of our views of where life originates because of this. Since we were doing all of this examination of the deep to look for these vent communities, people in their submersibles have also started discovering seep communities. These are also chemosynthesis dominated sites, but they're not associated with the high heats of the mid-ocean ridge environments. They're associated with high salinities or hypersaline areas where you have seepage from ancient limestones, ancient salt deposits that are sort of being dissolved and oozing out. And here's one in the Florida escarpment. Again, a unique water chemistry leads to chemosynthesis, which leads to unique life forms. Incidentally, a lot of the same taxa that are present at these hypersaline, super salty water sites are present in these super high temperature sites. And then there are some that are unique to both. But again, a unique site in the deep based upon chemosynthesis rather than photosynthesis. Besides the hypersaline seeps, we also have hydrocarbon seeps. You probably know that there's all kinds of offshore drilling for oil and gas in the Gulf of Mexico, Texas, Louisiana, etc. And they drill for oil there because it exists. It exists in the deep part of the sediment, but there are places where it literally is oozing out onto the seafloor. And just as we use petroleum and gas as an energy source, there are organisms that do that as well. And again, it usually starts with these worm faunas that are part of this. We've since then gone to other tectonically active areas. So subduction zones in convergent boundaries, they're not known for their high temperatures. In fact, there's low temperature gradients there, but there are seeps there as well. So as these plates are being forced underneath continental areas, they are flexed and cracked, and you have seawater sort of gushing through, coming out, and you have unique seeps there. And again, Here's some more giant clams. Far less of the rift worms, but you have a lot of the other weird taxa there. The fact that we have all of these vents and seeps and unique communities with extreme temperatures and the type of life that we call extremophiles, basically lovers of the extreme, high temperatures, low temperatures, high salinities, low salinities, high other alkaline or other chemical environments, have made these places of interest to NASA and our physics friends, our astronomer friends with the science of astrobiology. We have good evidence that other rocky bodies in our solar system and certainly elsewhere in the universe are going to have waters. And so if water exists and tectonics exists, and here's Europa, and you can see there are faults and fractures all over this thing, this astronomical body, is there chemosynthesis there as well? Would life exist there? So lots and lots of scientific interest now in these vents and seeps as potential analogs for how life might exist elsewhere out in the void, away from the Earth. And then finally, in the extremely new frontier, we are discovering from cores, from drilling into sediment and igneous rocks in the deep, 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 that life doesn't just stop at the upper part of the seafloor bottom. It is present potentially many meters to many kilometers deep. There are microbes, single-celled organisms, archaea, also performing chemosynthesis in the extreme deep. And some people have done modeling that say that this might represent a majority of the Earth's biomass. So all the life we see, all the stuff that's on the Discovery Channel and Animal Planet and National Geographic, some of the videos that I've put up for you, that's just sort of the frilly stuff, the eye candy that's at the surface that's visible, but the bulk of the biomass might be in the deep. And so now we have a whole bunch of people, again, astrobiologists, that are starting to study these deep biosphere communities as they're described here. And again, this would represent probably the best possible analog for life in other planets.